If you're watching this video, you've probably spent dozens or hundreds, maybe over 1,000 hours playing Slay the Spire. And if you're like me, you've also tried other roguelike deck builders over the years. Some are okay, others great, a few amazing. But eventually, you always find yourself returning for yet another climb of this tower, because no game can scratch that Slay the Spire itch. Why is that? Why is it so difficult for other games to do what Slay the Spire does? Well, the answer to that question lies in the way developer Megacrit created their game. Yano and Anthony Giovannetti's unique approach to game development is the reason why we keep coming back to Slay the Spire. So, Anthony Giovannetti and Yano originally met in college, where they collaborated on 2 small games. They graduated and moved to Seattle to work in the IT sector, but the fire to make games kept burning in both of them. A few years after graduating, Casey reached out to Anthony, asking if he wanted to make a game with him. Anthony quickly agreed, and in 2015, the duo quit their jobs to found Megacrit. Making a game without financial backing is a very risky endeavor, so they decided to give themselves 1 year. If they didn't have a good prototype by then, they'd return to their jobs in IT. Soon after, the first version of Slay the Spire was born. Megacrit quickly started running small-scale playtests. They shared Slay the Spire with family and friends and showed the game on local gaming expos in the Seattle area, observing how people approached their game. And soon after, they started recruiting their first online testers. The feedback from those early playtests was universally positive. A few testers were so into the game that they started creating art for the cards, just because they wanted to see the cards in the alpha build have art. As Anthony himself put it, when you have people who are doing stuff like that for your game, that is a really good sign that you have something compelling. So, encouraged by the positive feedback, Megacrit went into development full steam ahead. Design-wise, the team was in uncharted waters here, as virtual deck building games weren't really a thing yet, and that was exactly what they wanted to change. Slay the Spire is first and foremost a passion project of Anthony. He has been obsessed with card games for as long as he can remember. At the time, he loved playing Dominion, the board game that effectively kickstarted the deck builder genre. Anthony was also obsessed with the 2-player card game Android Netrunner. So much so that he founded stimhack.com, the biggest Android Netrunner fan site on the internet. While Dominion and Android Netrunner are 2 very different card games, they share the same problem. You need at least 2 people to play them. And Anthony's favorite part of these games was not necessarily competing against other players, but rather drafting a deck. That is why Megacrit decided to create their own deck building game, specifically designed to play on your own. By limiting their card game to 1 player, the developers had a degree of freedom designing cards they would not have had with a traditional multiplayer card game. For example, in traditional card games, designers are encouraged to avoid overpowered cards and combos. Every card needs to have more or less the same power level. If some cards are stronger than others, they will dominate the meta and prevent the other cards from seeing play. And while winning thanks to an overpowered combo might feel good for the player pulling it off, their opponent will not feel the same way. In Slay the Spire, overpowered combos are acceptable, even desirable. Because you're facing the game itself rather than another player, no one will feel bad if you pull off a 30-card combo that kills a boss in 1 turn. And you'll still feel smart and accomplished, releasing those precious endorphins that encourage you to keep playing. And while in regular card games the meta tends to be limited to a few powerful decks, Slay the Spire's random nature prevents that from happening. You're never guaranteed that you'll encounter a certain card during your run, so you're encouraged to be flexible and work with the tools you're given, which in turn makes building overpowered combos even more rewarding. One example of this is the famous Dead Branch Corruption combo. Dead Branch is a relic that, whenever you exhaust a card, meaning that a card is removed from your deck for that particular fight, adds a different card to your hand. But when combined with Corruption, which lets you play every skill card for free and then exhausts it, you suddenly get the potential to play dozens of powerful cards in a single turn. This combo was so powerful that it completely broke the game during early access. This run from content creator Jorbs shows how game-breaking it really was. Thanks to the Dead Branch and Corruption combo, he was able to beat the hard Slay the Spire's final boss at the highest difficulty level in one turn. This is obviously not the gameplay experience that Megacrit intended. In most card games, Dead Branch and Corruption would be either nerfed into the ground or even banned from competitive play entirely. Not so in Slay the Spire. Megacrit quickly changed how the hard worked, so one-turn kills were no longer possible, and later changed Corruption's rarity from uncommon to rare, making the card harder to find during a run. But you can still pull off this exact combo today, and it feels just as rewarding. It's telling that when asked about his favorite card, Anthony immediately mentioned Corruption, due to the, and I quote, obscene combos you can pull off with it. Another problem that Android Netrunner, just like many of its competitors, faced is bloat. Competitive card games continually need to release new sets and expansions in order to keep their players' interest. This eventually leads to bloat, which turns away new players because they're faced with an overwhelmingly large card pool and lack the knowledge experienced players do have. That is why Megacrit aimed to keep the amount of cards per Slay the Spire character very limited. During development, they discovered that Slay the Spire's sweet point is around 75 cards per character. More cards, according to Anthony, would prevent the player from planning out their deck and turn the game into a much worse experience. The most important rule was that every card in the game should have a purpose, while at the same time not being too overpowered. Their power would be counterbalanced with unique, varied enemies to avoid deck building strategies that could win every run. It was important to us that there would not just be a single dominant strategy that the player could always do, but that when building a deck, the player would want to keep multiple things in mind. Anthony's card game experience helped tremendously with the design process. Casey, on the other hand, was not as much into card games, preferring more actiony games like fighting games and roguelikes instead. That actually ended up as a positive during development. Because of that, we were able to have different perspectives on what to put in, and I think that works better than if just both of us had the same ideas. It'd be a little more stagnant otherwise. Megacrit's exhaustive design process eventually led to a total of 350 cards, 193 relics, 42 potions, and 4 classes in the final game. Combine this with the various sources of RNG, such as the cards you draw, the shopkeeper's inventory, and the maps you generate, and you get an almost infinite amount of variability every run. As you'd expect, creating all this took a lot of work. As the duo had quit their QA jobs, they were able to work on Slay the Spire full time. They worked 6 days a week, while also playing, quote, unhealthy amounts of the game. Casey acknowledged that he worked too much on the game. I would wake up, drink coffee, and I'd just work until my wife would come home from work. And then I would realize that I did not have breakfast or lunch yet. This process was only sustainable because Slay the Spire was their personal project. As the owners of their studio, they could choose how much they wanted to work, and they chose to work a lot because they liked working on the game. But an indie developer putting lots of work into their game is far from unique and doesn't guarantee success on launch. This was especially difficult in Slay the Spire's case. Not only would Slay the Spire's early access version launch in November 2017, traditionally the biggest month of the year for big budget AAA blockbusters, Megacrit also had to figure out how to get people interested in a genre that most gamers had never even heard of. Because as big as roguelike deck builders are now, back in 2017 they were not really a thing yet. Chances are you've never even heard of the game that started it all. The first modern iteration of the genre is a small indie game called Dream Quest, which was released in 2014. Dream Quest is pretty much the definition of a hidden gem. At the time of recording, the game only has around 250 Steam reviews. For comparison, Slay the Spire has currently over 125,000. While Dream Quest never gained any mainstream popularity, it did get the attention of perhaps the most important voice in the card game industry, Richard Garfield, creator of Magic the Gathering. He was so enchanted by the game that he contacted the Hearthstone team at Blizzard, urging them to try DreamQuest out for themselves. And they were so impressed by DreamQuest that Blizzard offered its designer, Peter Whalen, a job on the Hearthstone team. During his 5 years working on Hearthstone, Whalen had a big influence on its development, including the release of the popular game mode Dungeon Run, Hearthstone's take on a deck building roguelike. So, the few people who played DreamQuest at the time realized how much potential the deck-building roguelike genre had. But it's also not difficult to see why DreamQuest never found a big audience. Much of the card art feels like placeholder art from a pre-alpha version. There are barely any animations to speak of, and your character is a literal stick figure. Anthony and Casey wanted to make sure that Slay the Spire would not suffer the same fate. It was clear to Megacrit that they had to polish their game before releasing it to a wider audience. Not in the least because early access games had a very bad reputation at the time. More often than not, they were unpolished, buggy, and unbalanced. Anthony wanted to avoid this scenario at all costs. Our approach was to release an already balanced and near complete game in early access, and then keep expanding it frequently with more and more content. As I said before, back in 2017, deck builders had not exactly reached the mainstream yet, which meant that Slay the Spire would reach many players new to the genre. That is why one of the major goals of Megacrit was that everything in Slay the Spire had to be as beginner-friendly as possible. This all starts with the game's main mechanics. You need to kill the enemy to progress, while not letting your health go to zero. You spend mana to play cards. Attack cards do damage, while defend cards block damage. Relics give you a permanent boost, while potions are one-time use only. And that's pretty much it. The basics of Slay the Spire are intuitive and incredibly easy to understand for new players, which ensures that they do not feel overwhelmed from the very beginning. The complexity comes from the drip feeding of new cards during a run, and figuring out how all these mechanics interact with each other. This is also thanks to the way Slay the Spire handles difficulty. The game does not have the classic easy, medium, hard difficulty settings that many other games have. Slay the Spire starts with a single difficulty, with its harder difficulties locked behind various objectives. One example is the final boss, the Corrupted Heart, by far the hardest part of the game. Beginners will not be able to face the heart until they understand the game, because you can't actually access Act 4 until you've beat the regular campaign at least once, with each of the 3 original characters. And then there are the Ascension levels. Slay the Spire features no less than 21 difficulty settings, from the base difficulty Ascension 0 all the way to Ascension 20. Each Ascension level makes the game a bit more difficult. One level boosts enemies' HP, another reduces your healing capabilities, and so on. Ascension 20, the final test for every Slay the Spire player, even forces you to fight 2 bosses at the end of Act 3 back to back. Just like with the heart, you can't just start playing on Ascension 20. In order to ascend to the next level, you have to beat all 3 acts. The difficulty is even gated behind which character you play as. For example, even if you reach Ascension 20 with the Watcher, Ascension 1 will still be locked for the other characters. This system of unlockable difficulty, both with the Corrupted Heart and the Ascension levels, forces the player to learn the game properly instead of jumping headfirst in a difficulty they are not prepared for, becoming overwhelmed, and bouncing off the game as a result. And it ensures that experienced players always have something to work towards. Slay the Spire's user interface is another great example of how Megacrit perfectly walked the tightrope between the demands of new players and those of Slay the Spire's grizzled veterans. You see, Anthony and Casey had learned a lot by watching streams of people playing roguelikes. One of the big issues they had noticed was convoluted user interfaces. In the original Binding of Isaac, for example, you had to pause the entire game to see your attributes and items. This led to viewers joining the stream in the middle of a run, asking which items the streamer had picked up, which was annoying for both the other chatters and the streamers themselves. That is why Megacrit focused on what they call the streamability of Slay the Spire. All the necessary information is on the screen at any given moment. Because of this, new viewers can instantly see the progress of a run. Slay the Spire's streamability also makes it possible for viewers to work out in their head which moves they would make. In other words, they can play the game without playing the game. This makes the game a lot more enjoyable for viewers to watch. Another big issue many roguelikes had is the reliance on what Casey calls wiki knowledge. Let's return to Binding of Isaac for a moment. When you pick up an item, the game does not explain what it does, forcing players to rely on mods that add that functionality or look up the information themselves in guides and on wiki pages online. To avoid this issue, Slay the Spire offers tooltips for almost every element in the game. Its descriptions are also clear and concise, so they can't be falsely interpreted. This also applies to the game's random events. Important text is either colored in or animated, so the player can deduce all necessary information at a glance. Casey added this feature because he himself dislikes games that force him to read. Furthermore, there are a lot of small touches to the UI that help players understand what's happening on screen. For example, when an enemy intends to attack, the icon changes based on its damage. Small attacks are represented by a dagger, while a sickle warns the player of giant damage. And small debuffs have a green symbol, while a purple symbol symbolizes more dangerous skills. Of course, just because Slay the Spire is a very accessible game with simple and intuitive mechanics and a clear UI that does not hide any information does not mean that it is an easy game. In fact, at the highest difficulty, Slay the Spire is so difficult that winning every run is impossible for even the best players in the world. On Ascension 20, the win rates of the top Slay the Spire players range between 60 and 90% depending on the character. And yet, pretty much every seed, a sequence of letters and numbers that determines the RNG in a playthrough, is winnable. Content creator Forgotten Arbiter did the mind-boggling math himself. In a 2020 blog post, he detailed his search for the Slay the Spire run that is impossible to win. But even though he analyzed billions of seeds, he could not find one. While he estimates that it is possible to encounter a run that is impossible to beat, the odds are so tiny that in practice this will never happen. This leads us to a paradoxical conclusion. 1. That virtually every Slay the Spire game is winnable, and 2. That it is impossible to achieve a 100% win rate. How is that possible? Well, to answer that question, we need to dive into the game's design as a roguelike. Contrary to deck building games, roguelikes were a popular and well-established genre at the time of Slay the Spire's release. Introduced to the world in 1980 with the DOS game Rogue, the genre had seen a full-blown renaissance in the early 2010s, with indie games like FTL, Faster Than Light, Spelunky, and The Binding of Isaac establishing the roguelike as a mainstream gaming term. Slay the Spire shares several characteristics with other modern roguelikes. Dying means losing your progress, setting you back to square one. Slay the Spire also contains a lot of randomness. The map layout, enemies, random events, card and relic rewards, shop content, and even the enemy AI itself are all based on the seed randomly generated for that particular run. Just like any other well-designed roguelike, whether or not the player succeeds comes down to how they deal with this variance. But throughout Slay the Spire's development, Megacrit discovered that there is such a thing as too much randomness. For instance, in early versions of the game, maps were bigger, had more paths, and were way more random. Paradoxically, these features actually resulted in less choice for the player. Often, one particular route contained more chests and random events than the others, which made it very clear which path the player should take. So, Megacrit decided to reduce the variance of the map generation. The amount of columns was reduced, and map generation rules were implemented, making sure that every map has more or less a similar layout. The first room of each act is always a monster room. A treasure room containing a chest always appears at the halfway point, and the campsite always spawns right before a boss. The result? Players took more time weighing their options because each path is similar but not exactly the same. Megacrit also struggled with the intent system. In the original version of Slay the Spire, every enemy had a list of moves and would select one at random without telling the player beforehand. This made the game less enjoyable, because players felt like they did not have enough information to decide how to best spend their turn. So Megacrit implemented the intent system. Enemies display their next move, which makes players feel more in control, because they know what to prepare for. Enemies also don't behave randomly anymore. Slay the Spire's code prevents enemies from using the same move too many times. Some bosses are even completely predictable, rotating through a set list of moves over and over. But these examples are exceptions to the rule. Overall, the randomness of Slay the Spire is one of the reasons why it is so successful. There is so much variety that it is perhaps one of the most replayable games ever made, and the game does something that most roguelike games never manage, making losing not frustrating but fun. When you lose in Slay the Spire, it never feels like the game is at fault. Every loss can be attributed to the player making a bad decision. This can happen anywhere, during the battle itself, on the map screen, when picking a card. Often, bad decisions don't immediately reveal themselves as such. Rather, they snowball, growing bigger and bigger until they're out of control. But that's okay, because every loss represents a learning opportunity, a chance to do better. So, if you lose, so what? You can immediately jump back into a new game and try again. There's always a new strategy to try out. As Anthony puts it, the important thing is to quickly allow the player to start carving out new strategies or experimenting with new things. This was key. And if your runs are simply not working out with one character, you can always try another. Slay the Spire has 4 characters, each with 21 unlockable difficulty levels. If that isn't enough, there's also the daily climb, which lets players attempt a seed with unique modifiers every day and compete on the leaderboards. There's even a custom game mode which lets you adapt and break the game to your liking. And if that's not enough, the game has spawned a giant modding community with hundreds of free cards, characters and enemies to try out. A team of modders even made a full-blown expansion for the game, called Downfall, introducing no less than 8 new characters, each with their own cards, relics and mechanics. And it's completely free. So, we've established that Slay the Spire is incredibly accessible while offering the depth, complexity and content variety for hundreds, potentially thousands of hours of playtime. But there is one characteristic of the game that we haven't addressed yet. Despite all this content, Slay the Spire is incredibly well balanced. In fact, despite its huge player count and popularity, Slay the Spire does not even receive balance changes anymore. While most regular card games require regular balance changes to maintain interest in the game, Slay the Spire's last patch that changed the card was pushed out in November 2020. That begs perhaps the most important question of all. How did a team of 2 people manage to balance a game with an almost infinite amount of possibilities so perfectly on their very first attempt? Well, the answer lies in the painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso. Over the course of a year, the Spanish painter created 400 to 500 preparatory drawings before committing to the final version. That way, Picasso made sure that the painting looked exactly as he had envisioned it. Anthony uses this painting as a metaphor for his game design philosophy. Iteration and testing are key to the process of game design. This process started in the earliest stage of development. Megacrit first went to local gaming expos in the Seattle area with early versions of the game to see how players interacted with the game in person. But this took up valuable time, effort and resources that the 2-man team simply did not have. So they decided to take a different approach. Anthony first used his connections in the Netrunner community to get pro players to test Slay the Spire, encouraging them to break the game as best as they could. Testers could provide data actively by submitting bugs or feedback. Even players that didn't do this still contributed to the development passively, thanks to Megacrit's metric server, which gathered tons of data on every possible decision each player made. Based on both the feedback and the gathered metric data, Anthony and Casey would make changes to the game, which were pushed out into daily builds. Yes, you heard that right. Playtesters were able to test and break a new build pretty much every single day. This constant stream of updates kept testers engaged, even though the game was still in a very alpha state. Some playtesters racked up thousands of runs during the 2.5 years of development. Megacrit ramped up the iteration process even more with Slay the Spire's early access release in 2017. With the core game in place, the focus was on expanding Slay the Spire with new content while preserving its balance in the process. The player base grew steadily, and the team committed to releasing a new stable build every week, while the beta branch, which basically replaced the playtest builds, kept receiving near daily updates. Anthony and Casey's transparency with the community allowed them to make sweeping changes to the game on a moment's notice. A player could post about a bug on Reddit and receive a reply from Casey or Anthony a few hours later, saying that there is a new update out which fixed the bug. This aggressive updating wasn't limited to bugs. Megacrit could nerf a card one week based on feedback from the community, see how they react to the changes, and completely rework the card based on new feedback a week later. This update schedule also generated excitement. Players weren't frustrated because a patch didn't address their particular problem with the card, because they knew there would be another update a week later. In fact, people would look forward to the next update every week, wondering which cards would be nerfed or buffed. In a way, the weekly updates were a part of the gameplay experience. This process of analyzing metrics, listening to community feedback, and releasing regular updates lasted for over a year. With each update, Slay the Spire got a bit closer to its incredibly well-balanced state players enjoy today. Of course, there is no such thing as a perfectly balanced card game, and while Slay the Spire comes close, it is no exception. One character in particular is sometimes labeled as broken by the Slay the Spire community. Slay the Spire has an active competitive scene. Many of the top Slay the Spire players compete to set the longest Ascension 20 win streaks, which includes beating the heart in Act 4. The records are all relatively similar. The longest known Ascension 20 hard streak with the Ironclad stands at 19, the Silent at 27 and the Defect at 21. The record with the Watcher, meanwhile, stands at a ridiculous 52 wins in a row. Why is that? Well, the reason why the Watcher is so overpowered is also the reason why the rest of Slay the Spire is so well balanced in the first place. The game's first two classes, the Ironclad and the Silent, were in the game from the very beginning. The developers themselves stated that it took them over a year to balance and rework their cards just right. The Defect, the third character, was developed during early access. It first appeared on the beta branch in April 2018 and was released in June of that year. That means the Defect had over 9 months of active development time, receiving balance patches every week until the release of Slay the Spire's 1.0 version in January 2019. The Watcher was released on the beta branch in September 2019. The character was in beta for about 4 months, releasing with the 2.0 patch in January 2020. And, well, that's it. Megacrit released just one more balanced patch afterwards, in November 2020, but not a single card of the Watcher was changed in that update, because at that point Megacrit was pretty much done with Slay the Spire. Understandably so, after more than 5 years of active development. Anthony and Casey were busy scaling up their studio, hiring employees and getting ready for their next project. A fourth character was also not on their early access roadmap. Originally, the full release would only contain 3 playable characters. This also explains the Watcher's unlock requirements. To unlock the Silent, you simply need to play as the Ironclad ones. To unlock the Defect, you need to play as the Silent ones. But unlocking the Watcher requires you to beat Act 3's final boss, which can take a while for people new to the game. Comparing the Watcher to the other characters makes more sense if you think of the Watcher as a Slay the Spire expansion. A fun addition, but something that was never meant to be in the game in the first place. So, why is the Watcher not as well balanced as the other 3 characters of Slay the Spire? It simply wasn't playtested enough. And this is also what plagues any Slay the Spire content not made by Megacrit. The Downfall mod, for example, offers an absurd amount of new content, tripling the amount of Slay the Spire characters from 4 to 12. But when we consider how long it took for Anthony and Casey, who spent years on balancing Slay the Spire's 3 original characters, it becomes clear that it is simply impossible for an unpaid mod team to reach those high standards. Even for a team of professional developers, it is incredibly difficult to reach the standards Megacrit has set for the genre. Monster Train is perhaps the best known Slay the Spire-like. While it is clearly inspired by Slay the Spire, Monster Train offers several features that makes it stand out. You can combine multiple classes during a run, gameplay takes place on several floors instead of just one, you can upgrade every card 2 times, and there's a multiplayer mode that supports up to 8 people. It was also released to critical acclaim. Many reviewers called Monster Train the best roguelike deck builder since Slay the Spire, with some even proclaiming it as the superior game. And yet, Monster Train's balance comes nowhere close to Slay the Spire. It is far easier to completely break the game with an overpowered deck, which often lets you autopilot through the final part of the run, knowing that you've already won. It's a far cry from Slay the Spire, continuous struggle for the perfect deck that is always just out of reach. The Steam charts confirm this. Monster Train's player base pretty much flatlined shortly after its launch. Slay the Spire, on the other hand, is still going strong, and is in fact still growing. With over 14,000 average concurrent players, April 2024 was the second best month in the game's history. It's also telling that one of Monster Train's most popular mods is a balance mod that, according to its description, intends to provide a more interesting set of choices throughout a run, instead of funneling players into the same winning options every time. That is not to say that Downfall and Monster Train are bad. Quite the opposite. They're both fantastic, fleshed out deck building roguelikes that can provide hundreds to thousands of hours of playtime, but they lack the impeccable balance of Slay the Spire that makes every run such a tense, edge of your seat experience. And unless a developer does what Megacrit did, spending years on playtesting, balancing and iterating, chances are you'll keep returning for another attempt to Slay the Spire. How many hours have you played Slay the Spire for? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.